I wonder if I can ask you a couple things that I personally learned about neuroscience to maybe if we could have a bit of a dialogue around these things.
Sure.
Will that be okay? It's tip. So one of the things I learned was something quite profound to me, because I sort of had this sort of, I guess, maybe cultural sort of myth that, your brain is just kind of your brain. It's kind of like a hard drive. Like, you write the information on there once and it just sort of sits there. And what was very interesting to me in some studying I did for a sermon is that I learned that the brain is actually constantly changing. And in neuroscience, I'm told that this is called experience-dependent neuroplasticity, and that our life actually affects our brain. Maybe you might want to, dialogue. Tell me a bit more about this.
Yeah. It's an incredibly important principle. So this is how we learn. If our brain were completely hardwired and it is what it is, we would never be able to form a new memory. Now, I will say, except for some very particular and special cases that are crucial, we're not able to generate new neurons. So your motor neurons, your spinal cord neurons, that's it. That's what you've got. And if they die, or if you kill them with things like alcohol or reckless car accidents or what have you, that's it. They're gone. There's no replacing them. And as I mentioned, there is this special pool of cells that have the potential to become neurons. So they can develop, there's a couple of pools, but I'll focus on the hippocampus within what's called the granule cell layer. The details aren't all that important, but new neurons can grow and develop and connect to new neurons and form new memories. And within the neurons that are already established, there's massive forming and breaking down of the connections between neurons, something called synapses. And that's an incredibly important process as we learn and grow. So children, as they're growing up, have all this hyperconnectivity. And that's, I don't know if this is really true, but I like to think it gives some reason to like the children that are just, making all sorts of different connections in their mind. You'll be talking about a red bouncing ball and all of a sudden they're talking about squirrels, and then they're talking about roller coasters. It's like, maybe that's just the hyperconnectivity. But the point is that needs to be pruned away so that the connections that are most important get reinforced, and the connections that aren't get cut away, get deleted. And that's a process that happens a whole bunch in childhood, even through early adulthood, but it continues through our whole lives as we're reinforcing the connections that matter and de-emphasize, even destroying the connections that don't matter. And this is one of the ways that, one of the reasons that practice, just like a muscle in the body, when you practice, you strengthen that muscle. When you practice with your brain, you're strengthening those connections through repetition so that the ones that are used the most are the strongest, that are more likely to fire at the appropriate time.
Yes. Yeah, like I sort of discovered, neurons that fire together wire together.
That's right. Heavy in learning. That's good.
Yes. Yeah, and another thing sort of related to this is the brain actually takes its shape from what the mind rests upon. So like you were saying, the more we practice something, it can physically alter the structure of our brain. I wonder if have you heard about the example of the London cabbie taxi drivers?
Yes, it's familiar to me. Why don't you tell a little bit more about it?
Yeah. Well, I heard about this story through, I guess it was a study conducted by the University of London, and they studied all these individuals that went through their 3-year process of training to become black taxi cab drivers in London. And it's this really massive process that you have to undertake before you're allowed to be a licensed cabbie in London. Because what you basically have to know is you have to memorize every single street, every single little alcove, every path, you should be able to pick up anyone at one part of the city and take them anywhere in the other part of this massive city of 10 million people. And so it takes people years to achieve this. And in most people that go for this training, most of them fail the test the first time they take it. It's the test is called the knowledge, and you have to memorize everything, including even just like incidental things like what certain landmarks are called, so that a tourist could say, I want to go see Big Ben. And even though that they don't give you a street, you have to know what that landmark is. So anyway, they studied these people and scanned their brains. And at the end of the 3 years of training, they actually discovered that their brains had changed shape. And what they had, what changed shape, I believe, was I'm going to say this, it's called the posterior and anterior hippocampus. Does that ring a bell?
Absolutely. I've spent many, many long hours looking at the posterior and anterior hippocampus.
Yeah, and in London cabbies, that was twice as large as the average human.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was massive. Like they had these experience of actually physically changing because they had digested information. Maybe, do you want to tell our viewers what the hippocampus does briefly?
Sure, yeah. The hippocampus is the critical region for forming new memories. And so in a given time and place, as you're learning something or experiencing a new experience, it's anything that's going to be encoded in memories, these neuronal progenitor cells, these neurons that can develop into adult cells, fire together and wire together such that then they're creating these new memories and then seeding into the rest of the brain. And the complexity of all these synapses and these new connections is just enormous. I recently went to a lecture by Dr. Jeff Lichtman out of Harvard. This is the guy, if anyone's familiar with Brainbow, they're beautiful, beautiful pictures. Google it, they're gorgeous. But he's very interested in mapping what's called the connectome. So we've heard about the genome, the Human Genome Project, Craig Venter, Francis Collins, all those that in the 90s mapped out the human genome to know where all the genes, what our genetic material is. There's a lot of folks that are interested in the human map of our synapses, our connections, how the wiring works in the brain. Not unlike if you're trying to build a computer, it's helpful to have a wiring diagram for that as well to know how it all goes. The problem is it's just immense. And as Dr. Lichtman was lecturing, just staggering the number of synapses in the tiniest portion of the brain, to the point that many people feel like that's going to be impossible. Can the mind ever understand itself? I don't know. I have to think we can, because I'm a person of hope. And so, goodness, to just throw up our hands at this point sounds awful, but it's staggering the number of connections that then, to your point, are changing and growing all the time. And so it's very profound, and the hippocampus is really a crucial part of where that happens. So there have been famous studies. One of the classic examples is patient HM who was having seizures. And this is one of the early ways we learned what the hippocampus does. He had a bunch of seizures emanating from the hippocampus, as often happens because there are so many connections. And so to fix it, they removed the hippocampus out of his brain, which solved the seizure issues, took care of that, but then he could no longer make new memories. And so it was one of these early cues, like, guys, maybe that's a critical part of the brain. You should not remove it.
So this patient, like, just done for, like just not really there anymore after.
Very functional. So all motor control, all sensory control still had cognitive abilities, but no memory. There's another classic example of Clive Wearing, more recent example. Yeah, he's still living, I'm pretty sure. Well worth Googling some of the videos about him. He ended up having a viral infection that knocked out much of his hippocampus, and all of his short-term memory is gone. And so he spends his life moment to moment with really only a 5 or 6 second window of reality, and then it's forgotten. And so he has these journal articles where he writes line after line, I am now awake for the very first time. And he scratches that out. I am now awake for the very first time. I'm only just now awake for the first time. All my other entries are lies. He'll have a cup of tea and believe it's the first time he's ever had tea, but he knows that he likes 2 lumps of sugar, not 1. His profession was as a musician, and he doesn't remember any of the nuts and bolts, but he can stand in front of a choir and direct them perfectly. His wife will walk into the room and he'll be thrilled and just give her a big hug and just be so excited to see her, but has no idea who she is. So his emotional memory is there, but he can't name her name. He believes he's never seen her before in his life, but he knows he's thrilled to see her and loves her, gives her a big kiss. And that effect is due to the hippocampus and not being able to form those new memories. Now, well, just to the last point, once a memory is formed, where does it live? This is another question that's very complicated. Where does your 10th grade birthday party, where the dog ate the cake, where does that live in your brain? It's another one of those questions that is still being worked out.
Wow, amazing. I thought of another story about like the fascinating network of the brain. I was at this seminar where this nurse was explaining to us passers about people with degenerative mental diseases, specifically Alzheimer's and the like. And she told us this fascinating story about the power of physical symbols to the brain. And she shared the story of this minister who had gone into a full old folks home, and he had been presiding over the service, and they had wheeled in this one man that was pretty far gone. He just he sat in a wheelchair and he slumped down, and he didn't really say anything. And the assumption by many of the staff there was that, he's probably mute at this stage. He's probably, just too far gone. He's there, but he's not. And so anyway, the minister presides over the service. He's singing the hymns, and then he decides, at the spurt of a moment sort of thing, he hadn't planned it at a time, but he decides he felt really led to do communion. And so he went around giving each patient there at the old folks home, giving them each, the body and the blood of Christ. And when he arrived at this gentleman in the wheelchair, he didn't know where he was at cognitively, so he just offered them, and before the nurses could say anything, right? And the moment he offered the body and the bread and put it in his hands, this man, he just awoke and said, "It is good and right to give thanks and praise." And then the nurses just started crying, and they're like, "What is going on?" Right? And I guess there was something still there about like that act of taking and consuming the body and the blood of Christ that just awoke him. And it was like this, for many of the nurses on staff, they were just like blown away that's the power of a physical symbol. It just awoke something there that so I think that sort of fits in with some of what you're saying about the power of, we just don't understand what's all going on in the brain.
Sure. And we know that things like music and smell can be powerful triggers of memory. You'll walk past a certain kind of flower and it can bring you right back to a memory from long ago that you haven't thought of for years and years and years. And all that's in there somewhere. And as you mentioned, for folks that have experienced significant cognitive decline, can still have very vivid memories of things from their childhood or from their children's lives, even when they're unable to form new memories, even when they don't know where they are or how they got there. Some of these other longer term memories that are deep seated in the brain are still there.
Amazing. So I guess that sort of wraps up my first sort of like question to you about, yes, the brain is constantly changing. It's this diverse thing that's still a mystery to us. And, you know, the neurons are constantly wiring together by firing together, and we can physically have impact on our brains. Like I've told my congregation, you know, this is why I personally think as a pastor, you know, the Christian message of be transformed by the renewing of your mind, Romans 12:1, is such a profound effect on me when I read it in conjunction with neuroscience. Have you ever preached that passage, or is that a passage that sort of communicates to you at all, like sort of resonates?
Yeah, I did read your sermon. I thought that was so great. I've preached in the past around how the brain can be used, how we can use some of the characteristics of the brain in our, you know, prayer lives and other things, but I had never paired it with that verse around being renewed by the transformation of your mind. It was really great. It was a nice connection there. Cool. How did you, you know, come about pairing those things together?
Do you know, I think I just stole it from Richard Rohr or someone. Like, I heard someone just mildly mention it, and I thought I need to do more research on that. And so I just it was sort of one of those sermons where I was interested. So I kind of did like a research project on it, you know, presented it. So another thing I learned in my little, you know, this is me just doing very surface level study of neuroscience. And so this is why it's so helpful to talk to someone that's far more, you know, versed in this field. The second thing I learned is that the brain is very naturally wired for negativity, for fight or flight. Like, something I was told is that like 2/3 of our synapses are really looking for potential problems around us. Did you have anything to speak to that?
Sure, and you're absolutely right that we're wired for a couple of different things. So you mentioned fight or flight. That's this idea of the sympathetic nervous system, that when we feel threatened, all sorts of things are going to happen. Our, you know, stomach shuts down, we get a dry mouth, we start to sweat, all that adrenaline starts racing. You know, got to react right now. That's your amygdala, your fear part of your brain going full tilt. And it's a very adaptive part of our brain. We need that part of our brain. If you're about to get chased by a lion, you want to have the sort of autonomic response that is appropriate to that situation. The problem comes when the brain takes that too far, or it's not adaptive in our modern world. So, you know, we know folks that have that same sort of fight or flight sympathetic nervous system response to clowns, for example, that, you know, maybe you believe, you know, what you believe about clowns, but in general, we don't need to have the same reaction to clowns as we do to lions and tigers and bears. And so the brain can take.
Well, I don't know about that. Clowns are so scary.
Yeah, they are. They are. For many people, they are.
Yeah. But so maybe use a different example, but.
Right. Right. I mean, name your phobia, that it's just the brain taking something very adaptive and taking it too far. And the tricky part of it is once that system is activated, it's very hard to shut it down. It's much easier to prevent the response, prevent that adrenaline starting flowing, than once it's already started to wean off of it. It's like any chemical that you have in your brain or put in your brain, that once it's there, it's going to take a little while to wear off. And so becoming aware of these systems, becoming aware of how our brain works, can really help us kind of combat some of these maladaptive effects. And so knowing, okay, I know I've you know, I'm overreacting. I need to take a step back before this really gets out of hand, to breathe a little bit, to reactivate that parasympathetic system, kind of rest and digest counterpart to fight or flight. And so the awareness, this learning that science has given us about how our brains work, can really help us be better people, be better representatives of Christ during what could be very tough situations, when we maybe do feel threatened emotionally, physically, intellectually, to take that step back and remind ourselves what's going on, and use our brains to work for us, not against us.
What does the state of being fearful and stressed all the time do to our brain? Like, it, you know, if I'm always stressed and always sort of perpetually fearful and negative towards things, does that mean that I'm going to be more susceptible to that? Like, if I'm a stressed person, will I get more stressed in the future because this is constantly going around with the chemicals in my brain?
Well, sure. If you're trained to think about the world, about your situation in a certain way, it's easier to fall back on those ways. It takes practice and a renewing of your mind. It takes, frankly, redemption. The word means literally turn around in a new direction, to train one's mind in different approaches in looking at the world.
So do you think that it's possible to change? Is it possible? Yeah.
Some of it is going to be more hardwired, that particularly the older and older we get, but absolutely it's possible to change. And again, it's these functionalities that are generally adaptive. A little bit of stress is a good thing. It motivates us, it challenges us. It's when it goes into overdrive that then cortisol levels spike, and it can almost be habit forming to think of the world in these negative ways. But that's the whole idea of our brain's plasticity, that we have an opportunity to practice it and exercise it into a new way of thinking. I mean, we see the brain going into hyperdrive from its natural helpful things all the time. So there's this thing called heuristics, and that a classic example is how do we know that a chair is a chair? I mean, what is a chair? Name some things that make a chair what it is.
I'm gonna guess it has 4 legs. It has a surface I can put my butt on. It supports my back a bit. I guess those are
sure.
chairs.
And if I were to see something like that, I would be able to say, okay, that's a chair. But sometimes we see chairs with wheels on them. Sometimes we see chairs that are stools with no backs. As I'm speaking to you now, I'm actually sitting on a yoga ball. So it has no legs, no back. And arguably no real good surface upon which to sit.
I heard it's good for. I heard yoga balls are like good if you have back pain or something.
Yeah, I'm testing it out. We'll see.
Okay, well, let us know.
Right, I'll report back. But the point is, our brain is able to take these generalizations about what a chair is, so that you can encounter a new situation with a kind of chair you've never seen before and still be able to say, yes, that's a chair. Now, that's a good thing, but it's also essentially stereotyping. You're taking something that looks like a chair and saying it is a chair. And so then our brain is dependent on making these generalizations, because every time we had encountered a chair, we had to scrutinize and decide whether it was or not. We never get anywhere in our day. In many ways, stereotypes are very helpful. I have to be able to trust and believe that when I'm getting on a bus, that the person behind the wheel with their feet on the brakes at that moment, we hope, with a city bus uniform on, is a bus driver. I have to trust and believe that stereotype in that situation is true. But like with so many other things in our brain, it can quickly go awry. And we know all of the terrible, frankly, deadly consequences of stereotypes going into hyperdrive. And so it's important that we know these things about our brains so that we can take a step back and say, okay, I know my brain is trying to be helpful, but there are these consequences. Dr. Christina Cleveland out of Duke Divinity School writes a really great book called Disunity in Christ that talks about some of these more sociological and psychological principles as they bring to bear on our group making in Christianity, and our in-groups and our out-groups, and how our mind is sometimes working against what we're trying to do as the body of Christ. The other part of that is when we're stressed, so you mentioned stress, when we're in one of those fight or flight situations, our ability to counteract those negative stereotypes drastically decreases. So when we feel threatened, we're more likely to rely on those stereotypes and the messages that we've gotten from the media, from the news, through what Dr. Tatum at Spelman College identifies as the smog that we all breathe of things like racism and other prejudices. And so when we're stressed, it's really important to take that step back and say, okay, I need to calm my own self down, put a check on my own adrenaline, my own cortisol levels, so that I can return to a more rational state of thinking about these things. Now, that's very difficult.
That's interesting.
It's very difficult to do when you feel like you are in a life and death situation. And so, to look at some of our current events, so we can test some of this with what's called implicit association tests, where you associate good words with different races or really different groups of people, and you make these associations very quickly, and then it can measure how tightly you associate good things with one group and bad things with another group. So it's a measure of something called implicit bias, the bias you have without even realizing you have it. And people do worse on that test when they're stressed out or when they're fearful. And so it's understandable that in a situation where you might feel threatened, you might feel like someone's going to pull a gun on you, you might feel like there might be a threat to your own body, that those stereotypes might play a more heightened role than we'd like to think of ourselves when we're casually going about our day-to-day business. And so this obviously has life and death consequences for us in this day and age. Now, I will say to the credit of our police forces all across the country, on average, police officers actually do much better on these implicit association tests, and they also do better on them under stress compared to normal people in day-to-day life. To their credit, the problem is, of course, I'm not the one holding a gun, and so you have to be all that much better, all that much on point, and all the more important to be having those conversations during trainings about how the brain works and how these very real biological functionalities that are adaptive in many cases can have really tragic consequences when they get triggered at the wrong place and time.
Something I sort of thought as a connection to that is I was sort of thinking about, I tend to think about things historically, and I thought about many of the instances where we saw in the past, 100 years, like 20th century, where we saw a rise of prevalent racism and sort of xenophobic attitudes, and how in my observation, that's often connected to moments of crisis and stress, such as economic turmoil. Like, I think about, many historians have said that if it wasn't for the crisis of the 1930s and the Weimar Republic post-German World War I, that Hitler would have never gotten into power. And yet, I wonder, I was thinking as you were processing and communicating to us, this fact that our stress levels affect our rational cognitive abilities and our implicit bias, that when a group of people go through a stress-inducing experience, how much more like possible it is for our sort of underlying evil to almost break forth in us, those implicit bias that we don't even realize, and how we could be way more susceptible to it given times of crisis like war.
Exactly. And again, it's adaptive principles that have gone awry. I mean, way back when you're surviving on a day-to-day basis and, you know, warring tribes and all these things, it's healthy to have a natural skepticism of a stranger and protective. And certainly when there's a threat to your local community or your family unit, to be all the more heightened and aware of that. But we have to remember that those adaptive things need some moderation in modern times. And again, you know, we're biologically prone to fear the stranger, but what does Scripture tell us?
Yeah.
It tells us to welcome the stranger. It tells us to treat the stranger as ourselves. In fact, the word for hospitality in the original Greek that we translate today into hospitality is actually philoxenia. It's a compound word. That,
the love of strangers.
Exactly. Yeah. Phila, like, you know, Philadelphia, brotherly love, and xenia, you know, xenos, of the stranger. And so we're literally taught to love the stranger in Scripture, which is counter to a lot of our natural predilections, and we have to be aware of that and use what God's teaching us to counter some of that fear that comes up in us, particularly in scary times.
Perhaps this is the challenge to the church. It's to be people of peace and people of enemy love when the stress and the crisis moment come to us. So I think it's so important for the church to return to practices that form us. Because again, neurons that fire together wire together, and I'm just convinced that the power of what I've learned through neuroscience, even though I know nothing compared to you, is, you know, it's recommitted me as a pastor to the importance of leading people in prayer and well-formed prayer, right? And leading people to take time to breathe in and Selah and take in the Scripture and take in God's revelation. Sorry, you were going to say?
Well, just that you're absolutely right. This is the key role for the church, to be that moral compass, to take the things, instead of being afraid of science, take the things we've learned from science and use it to be a prophetic voice to our communities and to the world, to say, this is not what God would have for us. This is absolutely our time to speak up and provide that counter narrative that this is not what God would have for us. This is why we're tempted in our brokenness, in our historical, in our you know, our cultural and generational brokenness, our corporate brokenness, how we're predisposed to go, but that's not what God would have for us. And we also see that science has answers for us and how we can fix these things. Because look, God made our brains. God knows how our brains work. It makes sense that God would provide mechanisms through our bodies and our brains to counteract some of these things. And so it's no coincidence that prayer works, one, as a direct connection to the God of the universe. Things happen when we pray that simply do not happen when we fail to pray. But it's also good for our own bodies and spirits, and that's no coincidence. God,
there are atheists that pray because, and I know that's crazy, but I've read of stories of even like of people that are hostile to faith taking time for meditation because they realized that it calmed them as a person. I've read many a study about the health of prayer on the psyche itself.
Absolutely. Mindful prayer. But when I say mindful prayer, this is the kind of prayer that isn't just yipping and yapping at God with all your lists of demands and but mindful prayer, tuning into the being of God, has been shown to decrease blood pressure, decrease cortisol levels, that's stress hormone, decrease anxiety and depression, while increasing things like boosting your immune system, your resilience, your confidence. You know, it's like, prayer's like one of those miracle pills they advertise on TV, but without all those negative side effects to them, you know? And it's really no coincidence. I mean, there's all sorts of biological reasons why meditation and prayer would do that. I mean, we see the drop in cortisol, all these things. And again, it doesn't, people can hear that sort of thing and feel like, so that debunks God, or debunks, this or that, or because it shows up on an fMRI, but God knit together every fiber of our being and knows how to make it work at its very best. We know that prayer will connect our soul to God, and so why wouldn't it also affect the body that houses the soul here on this earth?
Exactly. Yeah, I'm with you there. Another thing I just wanted to talk and touch on very quickly, and we're definitely running out of time here, but did you want to speak to what is neuroethics and the various questions surrounding that, just before we let you go here?
Sure, and I will speak briefly because there are definitely better experts in these fields than I, but it's this interesting idea, or at least when I'm thinking in particular about the criminal justice system and how neuroscience can play into it, to what extent does the wiring in our brain and our genetics play into our behavior? Whether it is nature or nurture, it's all coming from somewhere else. And so we inherit our genetics, we inherit our young development, our synapses fire and don't. And so to what extent do any of us actually have any free will at all? We're formed in our mother's wombs, knit there, and that's where we get our genetics. It's where we get our early wiring. It's where we get our epigenetics that then shapes the very earliest choices we make once we're born, which then shapes our experiences, which then change our firing and our wiring and shapes that neuronal network. And so to what extent?
Yeah, just when you thought that free will discussions were limited between Calvinists and Arminians, here we are in neuroscience, still having these same discussions.
Completely, theologians have wrestled with this for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Thousands,
Yeah. And I'm here to tell you that neuroscience just makes it worse. Because
it does, it complicates things.
Even without throwing God into the mix, I'm not convinced that we do have free will, and that's different than my theology, and so I have to reconcile those two things. And so then what does that say about our culpability for any of our behaviors? So we already in our criminal justice system, at least in the United States, have a provision for criminal insanity, that your mind was not well enough, you cannot be held accountable for your actions. And so where's that line? Because you can imagine a situation where someone's, cortisol, gets spikes to terribly high levels. You can imagine a situation where someone's amygdala, that's the kind of fear, anxiety, emotion center, is much, much too large and overactive, and your cortex, which is generally your rational part, the part that kind of counteracts that and says, now calm down, let's think through this rationally, maybe that's too small. And so then that's not really your fault if you flip out and kill somebody. And where's the line? What do you have to be perfectly average at the pinnacle of the human bell curve to be held responsible for your actions? How far to the extremes make it so that it's not really any of your fault? So the neuroscience, the neuroethics around criminal justice are fascinating to me, and it's an evolving field that folks are doing a lot of study and thinking through these implications.
Yeah, I always thought pleading insanity was a great sort of plea by the lawyer. It's oh yeah, that's how I'll get my client off, right? I always thought temporary insanity was is this real? I don't know. It's tough because then I've experienced moments, as we all do, oh man, I lost my cool. I was far too angry there, and I wasn't myself, my base self. And yet, in what way am I still myself when I'm hopped up on anger or fear or anxiety, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and where is that line when we make others culpable for their actions?
Where can our audience find you, Katelin?
Sure. So the website for the church is www.forallpeople.org. That's the number 4, allpeople.org. You can reach out to me on Twitter. I'm Katelin Hansen 7, Katelin Hansen, and then the number 7. Or through my blog, which is By Their Strange Fruit, deals with racism and Christianity. And that Twitter handle is BTSF blog. And so
excellent. Well, thank you for joining us today. I know we barely scratched the surface, but thank you for taking your time to share with us your exciting field of study.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. It's fun to dig into some of those ideas.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Walker. If you like what you just heard, be sure to check out more of what we have to offer at MennoNerds.com. It's the hub for all things MennoNerds. From there you can learn more about these podcasts, syndicated blogs from people all over the world, books authored by some of our members, and a host of other exciting free resources for you and your church. Now there's one last thing. What we do costs a bit of money, and we're always doing it on a volunteer basis. We have people that are committed to making this happen, but we could use more people. If you like what we do, please consider donating monthly. We have 2 options. You can either do a monthly donation through Patreon, or you can give a one-time donation at any time through PayPal. We love the work we do, but we do need your help to keep it going and to expand into new territory. If you would like to donate, check out MennoNerds.com/donate. Thanks for listening, and as always, have a great day.